Policing in America, reform, accountability, and transparency. Will there be change?
You keep on hearing a term from some of our council members and some of our leaders that our police department is light years ahead of so many different other police departments. That's not true. Within the last 6 months, the police department killed someone in handcuffs.
Reading, writing, and arithmetic. What effects do armed police have on our children in the classroom?
The schools that are really beginning to thrive are the schools that are integrating mental health in their classrooms and their extracurricular activities and just hiring more counselors. And so we need more of that and less police.
And don't sleep on what's happening in the county. It's time to wake up.
We want to welcome you to another episode of Wake Up. Today on our show, we have Delegate Alonzo Washington and Dr. Johanna Williams. Our first guest joining us today is Delegate Alonzo Washington, who represents District 22 in Prince George's County. Thank you for coming on the show today, Delegate Washington, to talk with us. Continuing the conversation on policing in America, we wanted to discuss with our audience police issues specific to Prince George's County and Maryland. So to begin the conversation, a lot of police reform advocates are trying to amend or remove the LEOBR, the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, which is one of the most strict law officers' Bill of Rights in the country, which greatly favors law enforcement. So what are your thoughts on the LEOBR?
First, thanks for having me on the show. Really excited to have this conversation. This is one that has taken the country by storm and the world by storm, and making this a true awakening for Black people in America, and a true awakening for everyone that Black people have a voice and need institutional change and reforms that happen in America. And so the first thing as a legislator in the Maryland General Assembly, I'm going to take on is LEOBR, which is the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights. And what that does is limit interrogations of police officers to the state attorney general or his designees or sworn officers. And so that has been in place since the 1970s. And so we need change now. And so my job is to help repeal it completely. I don't want to see any reforms. I want to see this thing repealed completely.
Thank you, Delegate Washington. Thank you. But you have introduced a bill in relation to the use of force statute within Maryland for 2 years, actually. So can you explain to our viewers what that statute is and maybe the challenges that you have had in relation to pushing that legislation through?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I've been leading the charge on police accountability, reform, and transparency since I got in the legislature. The one bill that passed in 2015, right before the General Assembly session that occurred right before the Freddie Gray incident, my bill passed, which would make sure that we count the numbers of officers who are killing people on the streets. Can you believe that we weren't even counting those numbers before? And now, because of the bill that I passed, we started counting those now, and so we can have more informed public policy around policing. But right now, the state of Maryland does not have a use of force law. One of only about 7 or 8 jurisdictions in the country that does not have a use of force statute in law. And so my job and my bill that I proposed for the last 2 years was to just do that, to make sure that we have a law in place that says if a police uses deadly force, the criminal justice system can hold them accountable. Right now, in the use of force or daily use of force from police officers, unfortunately, they have not been held accountable in Maryland's history. We have not had any convictions. We need more of those because it's really bad at what's happening right now. So the challenges I had was with the FOP being against the bill. Our former chief of police was against my bill in Prince George's County. And so, those types of things have prevented the General Assembly from moving this bill. I'm going to reintroduce that bill, again, working with the ACLU and a few other thought partners to make sure that we can fine tune it a little bit more, but rest assured that bill will be introduced again.
And just to follow up real quick, can you explain to our viewers, you use the acronym FOP. Can you explain what that stands for and why that was a challenge for you in relation to your bill?
Sure. So the police departments within the country have a union. The police union is known as the Fraternal Order of Police. And so that union that represents the police departments across the state was against my bill, and have been against all of my police accountability bills. I can't name one that they were actually for. So, you know, and that bill, if I can just add, that bill was actually crafted based on the Maryland Police Training and Standards Commission. And so it's something that the police agree with and that commission agree with, but the police department does not want. The FOP, the Fraternal Order of Police, does not want that in statute and in law because they know that would truly hold them accountable.
Well, thank you for your advocacy, Delegate Washington. And I will say, as PGCYD president, we definitely will support you on that bill.
Thank you.
And all your efforts around police accountability. And just quickly, to segue to another bill, can you give our viewers some background on Delegate Acevedo's bill, Anton Black's law?
Yeah, so Anton's law is named after Anton Black, who was a 19-year-old Black man who died in police custody on the Maryland Eastern Shore in 2018. The bill would increase transparency in policing. It would require the public release of materials related to any investigation and any prior complaints against an officer after an officer-involved shooting. So that's a bill that I actually co-sponsored along with Delegate Acevedo. And so I look forward to co-sponsoring that bill again. And I look forward to actually voting for that bill on the House floor too.
And are you aware of any other legislation surrounding police accountability that may be coming forth in the next session?
You know, that's a great question. I think, as you all know, that the Speaker Adrian Jones, as soon as maybe a week after the incident happened with George Floyd, announced a work group to study policing and study the effects of policing and study accountability. So, you know, that group is working together. They're not studying the issue and trying to come up with new ways. They're gathered to make recommendations to the Speaker so that we can then put some legislation or some policy to paper. So that's really important. So no, I haven't heard any new piece of legislation, but I'm looking forward to what the commission comes up with. And as I listen to my neighbors and the constituents that I work for, you know, I plan to propose several other pieces of legislation around policing as well.
Awesome. And Delegate Washington, while we explore all the different bills around policing, would you support a bill to create an exclusion list or a do not call list, similar to the one offered by Kim Gardner, chief prosecutor in St. Louis, where officers whose misconduct was considered to be tainted, that the chief prosecutor would no longer accept testimony or evidence in court cases and will reconsider past cases?
Yes, I support this heavily. You know, I'm all for it. You know, I believe in accountability and transparency. You know, I understand that, you know, State Prosecutor Mosby in Baltimore City when she was trying to prosecute those 4 officers in Baltimore from the Freddie Gray incident, these types of issues came up. You know, these types of issues came up. And so we want to make sure that the prosecutor has everything at their disposal and be able to have flexibility and to be able to weed out any wrongdoing of these police officers that the public really doesn't know about, right? So I look forward to supporting that legislation. I think you're going to be hard pressed to find a piece of legislation about transparency and accountability that I'm not for. But I'm looking forward to supporting many of these pieces of legislation.
And Delegate Washington, while the country is focused on George Floyd, you know, within Prince George's County, we have had 2 incidents within the past 6 months of citizens dying at the hands of police, one in your district, Leonard Shan, as well as another man who was paralyzed in a traffic stop. You know, what are your thoughts on these incidences, particularly in relation to also the lawsuit brought by the ACLU and the Hispanic law enforcement against Prince George's County as it relates to racial discrimination and acts of violence against their citizens?
First, let me say that, yes, I mean, I am horrified by these incidents that are occurring around our county. You know, you keep on hearing a term from some of our council members and some of our leaders that our police department is light years ahead of so many different other police departments. That's not true. Within the last 6 months, the police department killed someone in handcuffs in a police office, in a car. In Langley Park, 2 incidents happened recently where a police officer at a liquor store pushed the guy down and the guy was unconscious, and the police officer never helped the guy or called for support for him. And then there was another incident in Langley Park where 2 officers were seen kicking a civilian down on the ground. You know, these use of force and these behaviors are not acceptable in our county, and we can't look to other places and say that, you know, we aren't them. You know, we are us, and we have problems, and those problems need to be weeded out. And so for that, you know, we're going to make sure that we have laws on the books next session that will prevent these things from happening, and be able to fire those officers immediately when something like that does occur.
And Delegate Washington, we're running short on time, so I just wanted to get your opinion on the recent proposal by School Board Member David Murray to remove SROs, school resource officers, in Prince George's County Public Schools. So I just wanted to get your thoughts.
You know, I think our school resource officers have a place in our Prince George's County Public Schools. I believe that the real issue here is that we have what they call security guards within our school that the school system spends about $17 million on. What Baltimore, and similar to what Baltimore City has, which is a school, police department within the school system. And so I think the school board needs to focus on those folks and ensure that there's more accountability there and there's more transparency there, and those folks are trained. And if they want to remove them from the school system, do that. School resource officers could be a link to help students. It could be used in a beneficial way, I believe. So I look forward to having more of these conversations. Being the education subcommittee chair in Annapolis, this bill probably will be before us in Annapolis. So I look forward to having a stronger conversation, a longer conversation about SROs in schools.
Absolutely, and thank you. We always appreciate your input. Thank you for joining us today, Delegate Washington. It's always great to have you back, and we'll be right back with our next guest, Dr. Johanna Williams.
Why should I care about the 2020 census?
Every 10 years, the census counts everyone living in the U.S.
Count everyone living with you.
Even kids!
Our numbers help shape funding and services.
For all these things.
That's a lot of stuff.
Your responses are safe and secure.
No matter who you are or where you're from.
We have reasons to care.
Shape your future. Start here at 2020census.gov.
Welcome to Wake Up. We are joined by our next guest, Dr. Johanna Williams, to discuss the impact of police in our schools. And Dr. Johanna Williams is a psychologist throughout the DC metropolitan area, specializing in family studies, trauma, and healthcare disparities. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Johanna Williams.
Thank you.
And just to jump right into it, Dr. Williams, you have an extensive background in the medical profession as it relates to psychology. Can you discuss with our viewers a little more about your background in relation to psychology?
Sure. I primarily work in private practice with children and families throughout the metropolitan area. But when I'm not doing that, I'm trying to be an activist and advocate in my community, working in schools and conducting talks and conversations about policing at various universities.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Okay. So jumping right into the conversation, armed police are often referred to as school resource officers when they are assigned to schools within the country, specifically in the county of Prince George's. That gives the impression that the police officers are providing some sort of resources in relation to mental health, counseling services, and this, that, and the third. Is that a fair assessment of the school resource officer or the school police, which they are, their role within schools?
That's a great question. It's a little complex in the sense that it's yes and no. Just some background, the Justice Policy Institute, they're a national nonprofit that collects data on disparities in prisons. And they try to change conversations about policy reform, schools being one of them. And they really look at this data with school resource officers on some level. And what we see is that because school resource officers are recruited from law enforcement agencies, their sole job is to ensure safeties in schools in the same way that they would if they were out in the community, in the street. That's their primary responsibility. But when you're sworn in as a school resource officer, on average, what the Justice Policy Institute has found is that on average, these officers are only getting about 3 days training in counseling, which is not enough training at all. Even in my background, I've had to go to school for almost 8+ or more years. So when you couple that with also having training vary state by state, because every school district has its own unique needs, these officers will sometimes get supplemental training within the schools where they learn about that school's district policies. But that training as well is only about 40 hours. So you're being trained to kind of be a counselor of such, but it's very limited in scope. And then we don't really have a standardized process to really objectively see if policing in schools is effective or not. The other problem with this is that if the schools themselves are not trained in multicultural competence, they don't understand implicit bias or how some of their practices target vulnerable populations, i.e. students of color and specifically Black males, then they are then giving policies to school resource officers that are defunct and ultimately possibly putting students at risk and putting them at harm.
Well, real quick, a follow-up question to that. You kind of mentioned in your answer about there not being any policies to ensure, I guess, or to show that school resource officers are actually helping in any capacity or keeping them safe. Do you know of any studies, just to kind of clarify that, do you know of any studies that show that school resource officers, their presence actually makes a school safer, improves academic performance, feeds into positive mental health? Do you know of anything like that?
Great question. So to my knowledge, back in 2017, the Journal of Policy Management had published a national study where they tried to look at the effectiveness of police in schools. And what they found was that starting back in 1999, when schools started to get federal grants to bring police officers in school, we saw a substantial increase in arrest from students between 7 to 14 years of age in middle school. We also saw 2 to 3 times more suspensions in school, and we saw that based on some correlational studies that were done, Black students were at higher rates of being the targets of those policies. So the data actually shows the opposite, that having more police in schools actually is not making them safer. It's making them actually a little bit more intense and uncomfortable to go to.
I appreciate that very much, and I always appreciate your advocacy. I know me being a young student a few years ago, I didn't feel any safer with police officers in my schools. But just to segue to the next point, what is the impact of armed police officers in schools on the psyche of our students?
Yeah, I think that once upon a time, before we really started to see an increase in school shootings, I think having officers and police for a number of other reasons, whether it was just community watch or to provide assistance, I think students may have been generally just curious. Why are they here? What is this needed for? But as our media has become more explicit and we are seeing more students be arrested, we are seeing young Black men now on video dying at the hands of police, I think students are, whether they are consciously aware, they definitely on some level are unconsciously being affected by all of this material. and scared and fearful, and then may act in ways that recapitulate all of the trauma that they are experiencing outside of school. Now, that's not to say that every student would experience that, but it is definitely a plausible and valid argument.
Okay, well, thank you. Appreciate it.
And so, what we've seen, like you said before, is an increase or a rise in law enforcement in schools and a decrease within mental health professionals in school. Can you talk about maybe your thoughts on that and how that would impact the school environment and school setting?
Sure, absolutely. For a brief time, I worked in the school settings myself, where I would conduct assessments for students needing academic help. And what we see in our school systems across the nation is that there's just not enough mental health input and mental health advocacy in our schools. And that is really taking a toll on not only the safety, but the emotional well-being of our students. And so you'll be lucky at a school if you get 2 psychologists or counselors. And typically they tend to be overloaded at some schools because they're having to assist students for academic needs and socio-emotional needs. The schools that are really beginning to thrive are the schools that are integrating mental health in their classrooms, in their extracurricular activities, and just hiring more counselors. And so we need more of that and less police. When it's in the reverse, what ends up happening to students is we see decreases in motivation. We actually see more problematic behavioral problems in schools, usually because students are operating out of a fear response, instead of operating from a place of positive reinforcement. So more counselors, less police.
More counselors, less police. I love it. I love it. Do you believe that police officers in schools perpetuate the school to prison pipeline?
I think that it would be unfair to say that the prison to pipeline conversation is a cause of just police.
What about a variable?
What did you say?
I said, what about a variable?
Absolutely. They are a variable or an agent in that larger conversation. And what I mean by that is it starts from the top down. So again, if you are in a school district that has higher crime, gang violence, community violence, school shootings, and more than 50% of your population are students of color or Black students, then what is the conversation in that school among school officials, and then how is that being translated to police? Police are there to enforce. So whatever they're being told, yes, they're responsible because they are enforcing policies that could potentially bring students harm, but they're not solely responsible for that issue if they're also being given distorted and harmful information.
Well, I appreciate your insight, Dr. Williams, and thank you for joining us today. We'll be right back with our final segment of Hot Topics and the legislative update.
There are a lot of ways to reach out to a friend about their mental health. Learn how you can help at seizetheawkward.org.
Welcome back. This is our final segment where Jana and I discuss hot topics in Prince George's County politics. Jana, we saw a very heated primary with interesting results throughout the county. Let's discuss beginning with the judge race.
Yes, the judges race was a very heated and very contested race. We had the 5 sitting judges, which included 2 males, Judge McCarthy and Judge Beriano, who were all wanting to be the Democratic nomination. What ended up happening, though, was challengers April Adamole and Gladys Witherspoon ran a very strong campaign, and they both became the other 2 Democratic nominees, including the 3 other female sitting judges. Now, on the other end, Judge McCarthy and Judge Beriano did win the Republican primary. So they are the Republican representatives. And therefore all 7 sitting judges will be, all 5 sitting judges and all 7 judges candidates will be on the ballots this November?
Well, as I've been saying, the future is female. So I look forward to seeing these candidates continue their race to November. And April, this is her second time around. So, I'm very proud of her for, finishing through.
Yeah, and seeing it through. But that leads on to the congressional races that we had.
Yes. We have Steny Hoyer, Congressman Steny Hoyer. This would be his 20th term. And we have Michaela Wilkes. So they had a very, very interesting race. Steny Hoyer, he had to campaign harder than he had in past years. Because Michaela, she was a viable candidate, and she got almost, 30% of the vote?
Yeah, about 33%. Well, the same can be said about Sheila Bryant, who ran against Anthony Brown. Now, they have the same credentials, essentially, in relation to their education, a military background, and things of that nature. And Sheila Bryant did put on a very good campaign. However, Anthony Brown, the incumbent, was able to get the Democratic nomination.
Absolutely. And so we have school board races. In District 7, we have incumbent Kennard Wallace. He lost to newcomers, Kenneth Harris II, and Alexis Nicole Branch. That was a very interesting race.
It was. K. Alexander Wallace, as he's known throughout the district, did lose, and he was not the Democratic nominee, and he will not even be on the ticket come the fall. But there's not a more interesting race, but a very tight race going on in District 4 between Shayla Adams Stafford and Brian Swan. Brian Swan is the school board member that was appointed by County Executive Alsobrooks. However, Shayla Adams Stafford is a former educator and leader and business owner within the community who ran against him and who won the Democratic nomination. However, they both got enough votes to where they will both be on the primary ballot this fall, or the ballot this fall.
And I'm just happy to see, of course, two young Democrats representing well. And I've seen Shayla, they have a grassroots campaign, boots on the ground. So it will be very interesting to see the strategy they employ going into November.
Now, we did see the policy that was put forth by the board or members of the board to address SROs and policing in schools. It did get tabled until September 14th. The appointed school board member, Curtis Valentine, put forth a motion to have it pushed back to even it being a discussion until September 14th.
And I'm very excited to hear this discussion. Lastly, there's going to be legislation on the ballot. A bill proposed by County Council Member Derek Leon Davis, which would allow a 10% tax increase on homeowners in Prince George's County, which would be put on the ballot for a vote by residents if passed out of the committee, which it did pass.
That is a legislation, which leads into another bill that will be put upon the ballot, and where citizens can ask for term limits upon the county council members. There's a big push to have this question or this legislation on the ballot for voters in Prince George's County to vote on. The grassroots campaign really does focus on the fact that there is a continuation of the same politics and the same politicians in the same seats for decades, several years, and there has been no real change within Prince George's County per what these advocates are saying. So they want to put term limits on the county council so they can't bounce from seat to seat to seat, and we can have new people and fresh ideas within the county council. So that'll be on the ballot as well. Derek Leon Davis has been in Prince George's County politics for several years, and he is essentially putting forth a bill that would have a 10% tax increase on homeowners during a pandemic. So, that's what it is.
And of course, I always appreciate talking with you, Ms. Parker, and we always have great dialogue. So, to all our members out there, thank you for joining us on Wake Up. See you next time.
See you next time.